Good afternoon, everyone. COVID 19 is a global pandemic and a serious threat to people's health, their lives, and their livelihoods. It has also brought economic activities to a halt. However, it is also been considered as a blessing in disguise, as it being seen that pollution is reducing and nature is reclaiming itself. This positive impact on the environment may be temporary, but government and individual should learn from this experience that on how pollution can be reduced on a long-term basis. It is against this background, the environmental cell of Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be university, New Law College, Pune, has organized this two-day online international conference on the perspective of global governance of environment in pandemic era. On behalf of the Environment Cell of Bharati Vidyapeeth New Law College, Pune, I welcome our chief guest, Honorable Justice Adarsh Kumar Goel, Chairperson, National Green Tribunal, New Delhi. I also extend a warm welcome to our esteemed dignitaries, Mr. Shardul Tiwari, Graduate Research Assistant at Michigan Technology University, Ms. Karuna Rana, founder of Sah Youth Organization, Dr. Philip Francis, Director, Flow Partnership UK, and Dr. Bhagyashree Deshpande, Principal, New Law College, Pune. I request Dr. Bhagyashree Deshpande, Madam, to render the welcome address.
Thank you, Dr. Dharma Madam. Good afternoon, one and all. Dr. Patanjali Kadam has established the Bharati Vidyapeeth on very first futuristic fundamental principles, post-transformation to dynamic education. He was not a visionary, but he overcame the ambitions of implementation of his ideas and thereby seeking social justice to the masses of the society. Honorable Dr. Shivajirao Kadam, Chancellor of Bharati Vidyapeeth, Dean to the University, is a renowned scholar and a very able administrator. Honorable Dr. Vishwadev Kadam, Vice Chancellor and Secretary of Bharati Vidyapeeth Dean to the University, who is also the Minister of Maharashtra State for Social Justice and Special Assistance. Honorable Barasan is a young and dynamic leader, and his uniqueness is that he leads by practice, not by mere theoretical words. Bharati Vidyapeeth has secured A plus grade by the NAC and is ranked 63rd by the NRF. Bharati Vidyapeeth New Law College Pune is consistently ranked among the 10 law colleges of India. Innovations and practices of the extension activities are the characteristics of the New Law College student. We believe that the aim of education is fulfilled only when it is applied and implemented in the society, and therefore we emphasize on the practical application of the theoretical principles. The college has established the environmental cell in 2019. The mission of the environment cell is just not only to bring the awareness of the environmental issues, but to try and make the people implement the actions which will substantially result in the environment protection. Our aim is to reduce the human actions which are in conflict with the environment and to substitute it with the human actions which are in consonance and in conformity with the environment. Out of the many activities, I would like to name a few of the environmental cell of Bharati Vidyapeeth New Law College. The environmental cell, the coordinators and the student members of the environmental cell have conducted a fieldwork research. The research object was to assess the impact of the rules and regulations on the tribals of the Tadoba sanctuary. One aspect is to assess the impact of the rules and regulations on the animals which are there in the sanctuary, and the other is to assess the impact of the tribals which are what is the consequence of those rules and regulations. A wonderful research work they have done. Currently, the New Law College is preparing a white paper on the Munamudha River of Pune district. in furtherance to regenerate the Mulabutha River. From the past 4 months, we are facing the hazards of the coronavirus. It has affected the societal life in all its spectrums. Environment is also affected both positively as well as negatively. In India, due to the lockdown situation, as there was no traffic, there was consequently less air pollution. However, on the other side, the adverse effect of the lockdown was this that there were many cases of hunting in the sanctuaries in Maharashtra. Protection of the environment as well as the coronavirus both have a global impact. It may happen that a single state or a country will not be in a position to handle both the global issues. Therefore, there is a need for the universe to unite and unify the efforts to govern the aspects of the environment protection in the pandemic era. And hence, Bharati Vidyapeeth New Law College has organized the two-day online international conference. I'm sure we all are very enthusiastically and eagerly awaiting for the experts to elaborate upon the thoughts. I will request Dharma Madam to take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, madam. Our chief guest for this momentous occasion, Justice Adish Kumar Goel, is the chairperson of National Green Tribunal, New Delhi. Justice Adarsh Kumar Goel, born on July 7, 1953 at Hisar, Haryana, did his BA Honours and LLB from Punjab University. Sir enrolled as an advocate with Bar Council of Punjab and Haryana on July 16, 1974. He practiced before the Punjab and Haryana court for 5 years and then Supreme Court and Delhi High Court for about 22 years. In 2005, Sir was appointed as the Executive Chairman, Haryana State Legal Service Authority. In 2011, Sir was sworn in as the Chief Justice of Guwahati High Court, and in 2013, he was sworn in as Chief Justice of Orissa High Court. On July 7, 2014, Sir was elevated to the Supreme Court. He was the first person from Haryana to become a Supreme Court judge. He has boldly taken up various controversial social and religious issues such as triple talaq, abuse, SC/ST Act, and safeguards for women in matrimonial disputes, and given a landmark judgment. Presently, Honorable Justice is serving as the chairperson of National Green Tribunal. While dealing with the issues of pollution in Satluj and Bias, in Shobha versus State of Punjab and others, the tribunal, on the basis of polluter pay principle, imposed a cost of 50 crores on the state of Punjab. To curb with the issues of illegal operation of steel pickling industry and inaction on the part of Delhi government, the bench headed by Justice Goel in All India Lok Adhikar versus Government of NCT Delhi and others imposed a fine of rupees 50 crore on Delhi government for its failure in regulating these industries. Our chief guest judgments are testimony of his unrelenting efforts at ensuring that environment is protected and the legitimate interest and needs of the future generation are not jeopardized. It is an honor to welcome you, sir, to this international conference. May I now humbly request our chief guest to address this gathering. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Uh, First of all, I compliment the efforts of Bharati Vidyapeeth in the field of environment. And in my view, it is these efforts which are very, very crucial. Efforts of the educational institution so that you have awareness to the next generation. Because the earlier generations have not brought about a very, very welcome situation. We have some statistics. We have 62% untreated sewage is going into the water. 70% untreated solid waste is being unscientifically handled. We have more than 4,000 garbage dump sites in India, which have yet to be remediated. Then there is a biomedical and hazardous waste. We have coastal pollution. 351 river stretches are declared polluted. 100 industrial clusters are declared polluted. 120 cities are declared air polluted. So this is a serious challenge. There is a to all the water is there is no recharge of the groundwater. Water table is falling down continuously. Uh, Close to the railway stations or railway lines or on the highways, you can find illegal construction. So there is increased encroachment of the water bodies and catchment areas. The regulatory mechanism is not adequate. So it's people's initiative which becomes very. So people have to rise to the occasion. The environment is a tool which can empower the system, which can about it. Now the topic which we have chosen, is global governance in pandemic era. I have a slight disagreement. Pandemic era is not, we can't take it as a permanent, it's a very momentary thing. Few months problem, few months virus is not the era. I agree with you that during this period, there is a lockdown. On account of the lockdown, nature could have some relief. There was a drop in pollution, there was a drop in water pollution, there was a drop in ice pollution, and there was relief to the wildlife. But this is a very momentary thing because of the lockdown. So let us not draw much inferences from it, except that nature has got something. It doesn't mean that we have to treat nature because of lockdown different. Certainly, we feel good that the nature has a sign of relief. There is less air pollution, or water pollution, or noise pollution, or better environment for the wildlife. But that's not enough. Environment is a subject which needs to be handled on a permanent basis. It's not dependent on a particular event. So it is the mindset change. What is the attitude towards environment? In India, we have thinking on environment since ages. In our text, there is a reference to environment. Our religious heads, our political heads, they have shown their concern. A common man also feels honor in welcoming, in worshipping trees, in worshipping nature, worshipping the rivers, worshipping the earth. So this is the attitude. How we treat water, air, earth, soil, trees, wildlife. That attitude, is it an attitude of superiority of human being over nature? Do we want to conquer nature? Do we want to exploit nature? These are expressions used in certain areas. These are not the areas. In the first World Conference on Environment in 1952, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi took objection to this attitude. She cited from the Indian texts, ancient Indian texts, that the approach in dealing with the nature is that nature is giver. But then you have to respect nature. What you are taking the nature, you have to express your gratitude. Your attitude is not to be hostility. It is not an attitude all right to exploit the nature. She mentioned, you can't say we have conquered Himalayas. We may have climbed Himalayas, but we can't say conquered. So we are exploiting our resources. We are exploiting mines and minerals. We are using groundwater. But what is the approach to be adopted? These principles, sustainable development, intergenerational equity, precautionary principle. What are these principles? These are not high sounding words and these are not complex words. So let us understand them in common sense. It is nothing but like carrying capacity. Means what is the capacity of the nature? What is the capacity of the system? Supposing it is Earth. Earth is the only planet out of so many planets where there is life. And the life is because of the balance. So the balance is sustainable. In a city or in an area, supposing you have unlimited number of people, unlimited number of vehicles, is it sustainable? If you are drawing water continuously from the earth, how far will you go? The aquifers of the which are storing the groundwater have their own capacity. You can't go beyond a limit. Similarly, doing mining is to be done also scientifically. So eco-fragile area. How much construction, how many multi-story buildings you can make. All these things depend on the minds and regulation. We have different regulatory systems in the world. We have a system where it is called command and control system. Command and control system where the law is very effective to make a law, and that law is followed by everyone. That perhaps we are not. We have always been fighting the regimes. Unfortunately, for a long time, we had foreign regime, and we had non-cooperation movement. We had satyagraha movements. We were fighting because the regimes, we were not having trust in the regime. So command and control systems even today are not acceptable. Any regime which comes, the regime is opposed. The other is a market system where everything is controlled by demand and supply and uh, economy, financial concentration. That system also is not effective here. So therefore, it is the people involvement or people understanding of the system which is very crucial. If you can have this discussion, if you can have commitment to the environment at individual level, at social level, and if it is a people's movement, this is the model of governance of environment which can be successfully made. These are very briefly my views. If anyone has any questions, I'll be very happy to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for your enlightening speech. Let me confess, it had a unique epistemological context whose relevance shall reverberate in the conscience of today's participants and generations hence. We, at the Environment Cell of Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be University New Law College, Pune, are of the firm belief that with you taking charge at the helm of affairs in the National Green Tribunal, environmental jurisprudence shall get a new lease of life, furthering the cause of sustainability and conservation. Sir, on behalf of the Environment Cell, Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be University New Law College, Pune, we extend our sincere gratitude to you for taking out your precious time from your busy schedule and sharing your insights on this topic. Sir, once again, reflecting upon the emotions of every student, every faculty member, and every staff associated with Bharati Vidyapeeth University, we say thank you. May I now request all the participants to switch on their cameras for a group photo, please?
Done, sir. Done, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We now proceed to the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now joined by a dignitary who has rightfully established himself as a distinguished academician and a prominent energy activist, Mr. Shardul Tiwari. Currently based in the United States, Sir is currently pursuing his PhD on environmental and energy policy. Sir is a research scholar and an energy transition lab fellow at the Michigan Technological University. Sir also has rich experience of working alongside with both public and private sectors. Some of his associations include the Nepal Energy Efficiency Program, the German Development Corporation GIZ. We welcome you, sir, to this event. May we now request you to kindly address this gathering. Thank you.
Shardul sir, please unmute yourself. Shardul sir, yes.
Sorry about that. I'll try to share my screen. Please give me a minute.
Yes, sir.
Sure. Perfect. Good morning, everyone to India. I hope I'm audible and you are all able to hear me. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I hope everyone who is listening is doing all right and their families are doing all right, given the current COVID-19 state of pandemic, which we are currently in. Hopefully, it doesn't last long. I would like to begin with saying thank you to Dr. Bhagyashree Deshpande, Principal of Bharati Vidyapeeth Deemed University, New Law College, Pune, for inviting me to speak. And it is an honor to speak after Honorable Mr. Justice Adarsh Kumar Goyal. So, without further ado, the topic on which I would be speaking today fits very well, which was outlined in the introduction, as in what environmental cell is trying to achieve and the research which they are trying to do. So, I'll be speaking on justice and emphatically on applied justice theories. So, for example, environmental and energy justice and how both of them are very closely interlinked with each other. And it is interesting in the current scenario of pandemic to talk about justice is because, and especially with all the students here, because justice, as we know, is the forte of lawyers, right? And lawyers are always fighting for justice to uphold the law. However, today, as a non-lawyer and a policy researcher, I shall be talking about justice in theoretical and applied context of policy making, both historically and in the current scenario, by giving the examples basically here in US and briefly talking about how it has happened in India. And I'll be bringing my both research and practical experience into it, right? So before going into the presentation, what I'll be trying to do is first we will look into some of the seminal works in justice theories, right? That how do we define justice theories, right? And we have some amazing speakers and experts like Dr. Adarsh Kumar, Honorable Dr. Adarsh Kumar already spoke about law. And tomorrow we have Ms. Krishni speaking on law as well, who is a lawyer. So if there is any question pertaining to law, I'll defer those questions to the expert. And what I shall be talking about is the academic and the research part of environmental energy justice, right? So to briefly go through the agenda, first we're talking about Western justice theories, some of the seminal works, and then look into how these theories can be applied or has been applied, or to what extent they have been applied in the current context of environmental and energy policy formulation, right? Now, I'm giving example of both environmental and energy justice because both of them are very closely linked to each other. And to give an example, one of the major cause of environmental pollution today is how energy is being generated, as was pointed out earlier by Honorable Justice as well. It is whether it is coal-fired power plants or whether it is carbon-based power plants. And then we will look into how we can tap into these using these theories and using these application in our academic research and even to the things which environmental cell is rightly doing so in Pune. So justice, defining justice is very contentious, right? So justice can be looked from two perspectives. One, attaining justice, and the other point is what is justice? Like what is just? How do we define just? And I shall be focusing more on the later part of the discussion, right? How do we define just in the social realms using social theories and philosophies, and how we can apply them in policy making context, all right? So the three theories which I outlined below are one of the most seminal works of justice theories, especially in the context of environmental justice or the work which I've been doing, right? So the first one which I want to bring, and this is just a recap, like a very short recap of these theories. So the first one is the social contract theory. And it is nothing but it talks about the individual moral obligations are dependent on agreement amongst them to form the society. So, for example, in current context, it will what we call as nation states or nation or countries, right? In layman terms, what I'm trying to say is in any country or in any state, an individual surrenders some form of freedom to its authority in exchange of protection of rights and social order. So, to give an example, in India, in some of the states, alcohol is banned or drinking alcohol in public is banned. So, what has happened is an individual has submitted his freedom to the state, and rightly so, with state giving the protection to the citizens by submitting this freedom. Same can be taken as an example of that guys cannot get married in India under 21 years of age, right? So this is nothing but state individuals giving their freedom away with states providing them the necessary security. And there is something which is derived from the social contract theory. But then this raises the important question of obligation versus benevolence, as in to what extent can we push this boundary, right? So, for example, and this is a self question to ask, emulating question to ask, as in, so Delhi government said that they will give first 200 units of electricity free, right? So, how much it is justified in what context? Again, this is just an example. Now, from the social contract theory, we come to the second point, and again, this is all will feed into the application of environmental justice later. And the second thing which we are talking about here is the John Rawls seminal work on theory of justice, right, which is a political philosophy, and he talks about in his book about what is theory of justice, right? Now, this apolitical theory, which it talks about society in the way it is structured, right? So a citizen can get as much liberty as it is possible, and again, I'm paraphrasing from his book, as long as the liberty is not infringed upon by upon the liberty of others, right? So if there's equality in the society, that every citizen should be equal enough, not just in terms of word, but in terms of having the power, in terms of meaning to fight for the election, for example, right? They should have same straight way to stand up for the election. Like, and again, this is a question to the lawyers: like, is it so in India? Like, can we think that it is happening in India, right? So, and what this the argument which John Rawls drive is from that he says he argues that humans innately are driven or motivated by self-interests, right? And hence we need institutions in the country which can regulate, which can protect the environment, which we have governments, courts, and laws, because individuals are motivated by self-interest. Now, the interesting thing about this is this argument has been uh, critiqued by Amartya Sen, whose work is based on Homo economics, as a lot of you might know as well. That actually individuals do think of others, right? Humans have this desire to eliminate injustice, and injustice is not a binary phenomena. It is a grayscale area. It is not a 0-1, right? This is what has been argued by Sen in his work. And what is interesting thing about his work is he derives a lot of his work from Bhagavad Gita and non-Western theories, as we call them, and which is not very popular, at least here in US. So now these are the three seminal works, and what do we derive from them, right? So what we derive from them is the type on the ways on how we can define justice. So one of the ways is the corrective and distributive justice. Now this particular point is very relevant in terms of environment. environmental justice when we talk about, and especially in the current scenario, right? Because corrective justice talks about that, for example, there is a firm, it has already polluted the environment, and then we impose some sort of uh, intimation or fine on them to correct the wrong which has been done, right? And the second thing which talks about is the distributive justice, that whether in our society the gains and the losses have been equally distributed amongst everyone. And this is a very important point, and this is the point which I'll be building on throughout the presentation. I'm sorry. So if a coal power plant is being established, right? Now that coal-fired power plant is polluting our atmosphere. Like, so the air is getting dirty for everyone. But is there one particular section of society which is getting affected more by that polluted air? And is there a one section of society which is not getting benefits of that electricity which is being generated through coal-fired power plants or not? So what distributive justice in this particular context talks about is if opportunities from a particular context and threats are being equally distributed in a society. And we'll take this particular point of corrective and distributive justice and build up on the examples here in the US later. Then comes the case of procedural and the substantive justice. It is the idea of fairness on how do we resolve disputes and the law constraints and how do we direct human behavior. Another interesting thing which came up during the introduction today was about animals, right? As in, I think the environmental cell is working towards animals' rights and thing. So this is how one of the ways how it can be targeted is using the human and non-human approach of justice, right? So should justice be only served for humans, right? So we have, I think last month we had an outrage over a pregnant elephant which died in Kerala, right? So it was all over the news feed. So now, when we talk about defining justice, and especially in case of environment, to what extent do we and should we not, like, again, in my perspective, we should put animals at par with humans, right? So is that how we should define it? So these are the few questions which we'll try to answer over the course of the presentation. And then the other ones are relational versus non-relational, as in the relational justice talks about, and again, I'm defining justice here in terms of how to use it for environmental applications, right? So relation as in, do we develop a cooperating behavior where the agreement, negotiation, arbitration, dialogue is possible or not, or is it a non-relational one where there is no interaction and association, it is just based on the acts and deeds, right? And then the final one is about the deontological and consequentialism, whether justice should be based on actions or should it be based on results, right? So if the results are good, no matter what path is taken, is it okay? And should it be about path? If the path taken is all right, should we even worry about results, right? And now, again, one of the important things here to consider is it is not black and white, like it is not binary, it's always grayscale. So there'll always be a Venn diagram where you will have a partial deontological case and partial consequentialism, right? So there'll be always interdependence. Now this is the theoretical foundation for this particular presentation, like a brief foundation which we'll be working on. So now let's look at the application of justice, right? Now we all are aware that there have been environmental concerns, right? So the temperature of the planet is rising. We all know the levels of PM 2.5 emissions in big cities in India and even here in the United States. But in this particular presentation of environmental justice, I want to talk about if this pollution is affecting disproportionately a particular section of the society, right? And this particular section of the society can be demarcated in any of the ways. So for example, it can be on the basis of gender, it can be based on the race, color, caste, origin, or income, for example. To give you a small example, in rural India, like where at least it's not that predominant now, but 15 years back, like wood was used to cook food inside the household, right? So now, because women used to cook food in their house and still do, like in rural India using wood, they were disproportionately disproportionately more affected, women and adolescent girls, due to indoor air pollution and health hazards because they were cooking food, right? So they were unjustly, because of the societal norms, they were getting affected due to that concern, right? So now the presentation of today for me is about if any neighborhood, any under, do we have evidence? And I'll be talking about US and then thinking if we can develop, or to what extent can we develop it for India, have discriminatory effect on one particular section or one particular people of color, right? At the same level, the perks and the disadvantages of environmental pollution and the energy foundation is giving advantage, disproportionate advantage to one section and disproportionate disadvantage to the other section of the society, right? So let's look at the case of US, how it has developed over the years. Now, there has, in the case of United States of America now, there is an agency called Environmental Protection Agency, and it is now well established, and I'll give you examples in the coming slides, that there is environmental injustice which happens based on color and race here in the United States, right? And the history of it, at least to some extent, I tried to capture in this slide or the next slide, as something recorded. It started in 1968. So, for example, in United States, people of color and back in those days, African Americans, they used to be the predominant sanitation workers, right? They used to do the dirty job, as it was called. And so Memphis is a place in the US, and they had a sanitation strike there because of how worse the condition were, how worse the working condition were, right? And it happened in 1968. So, and then later in 1982, there was a case where a movement of environmental justice came about because of the practices which were happening. So, and this example of 1982 will go into detail later, like what happened. But what it was about was a landfill was filled in a African American community, which with people living already with hazardous substance, right? It was polychlorinated biphenyl. Like that's what started the movement, right? So now what has happened here is in those 10-15 years, there was an activism, there is a movement that there is an environmental injustice happening. What happened after that was a general accounting study was done by the state, that particular state, for the community, that to galvanize if there is these kind of injustices happening across the United States, right? And by 1987, the study found out and concluded that over 15 million African Americans and 8 million Hispanic people in United States live in Superfund sites, and Superfund sites are nothing but the sites where you dispose either nuclear waste, hazardous waste, as in where you have very predominant chances of getting a health-related disease like cancer, right? So the study concluded that African American, Hispanic people do live in disproportionately, they do live in sites which are Superfund sites, right? So what happened after that was, from activism to research and then to policy making, then the government started getting out the executive orders here in US that yes, environmental injustice is happening to minority population in the United States, and we need more evidence to make it more mainstream, right? And this what led to Harlem Environmental Act in 1990 for the treatment of sewage water plants, that the water plants should be treated. It led to in 1991 first people of colors environmental leadership summit, which has been going on since then. In 1993, advisory councils were created, and again the executive orders were coming out constantly over the periodic terms by the US federal government regarding environmental justice for minority population and low-income population, right? And now we have reached a stage where every proposal, when it comes to research, when it comes to application, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States mandates that it should include a component of environmental justice, right? Whether a particular section of society is getting affected by it or not, right? But is it the end? Of course not, right? There's a lot more to come. And there's still cases of injustices happening in the country. But this gives us a snapshot of how from activism to research to policy making, and then refined as policy making goes on, right? So now let's look at the one particular example of 1982 of Warren County. Now, what happened was, Florida, if you can look at it online, and some of you might already know it. So PCB is a polychlorinated biphenyl, is a hazardous substance, right? And what they did in Warren County, North Carolina, was that the county decided that they can dispose of this into a landfill, which was right there in the community of colors, right? Now there were protests over it. There were 550 arrests over it, and it was considered as one of the largest civil disobedience movements since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It happened in the United States, right? And the term first called environmental racism gained prominence during that period, right? So as you all be seeing, like in the current, there are a lot of racism movement which happened in US in the last month because of the events which happened here. But the environmental racism, the term was first coined then, right? And since then, so they lost the battle back then, right? So for example, the county went ahead with the plan, right? And then later on, the report came out that 3 out of 4 commercial sites, out of 4 commercial sites, 3 commercial sites are located in Black neighborhoods or in the neighborhoods of people of color. Now, this graph shows you the bigger picture. That was one particular example, right? But you can very well say that that is an anecdotal example. But this gives us a much wider picture of how it is here in the US, right? So, for example, if you look at the table on the left-hand side, right? So, positive difference shows you that even with less population of Hispanic, Blacks, and Asian, and American Indian, and those who are not familiar with the American Indian here is the term which is used for the indigenous people here, right? And so the Superfund sites are located at their facilities, like very disproportionately to their population, right? So in case of, and this is within the distance, right? So if you look at the case of Asians living here, so there's like 5.3% difference, as in a positive difference of people living closer to the Superfund site. And Superfund is again a site where you dispose of the hazardous waste. For example, now I have a series of graphs using GIS to show how it works, right? So for example, look at this particular graph. I hope you can see my cursor moving, right? So the green lines are the sewer lines in the city, and this line is the city boundary. And this is Mebane County in North Carolina, right? Now, and the color gradient shows you the percentage of African American population, right? Now, if you look at this particular graph, the darker the color becomes, as in more the numbers of African Americans are living in a community, the farther they are from the sewer lines and closer they are to the city limits, right? Even though the city limits is much higher, the sewer lines are morely concentrated towards center of the city where the African American community is not living, right? And now, I think it was Professor Robert Bullard who wrote this once, right? He said, whether by conscious design or institutional neglect, right? Communities of color in urban ghettos in the United States and in rural pockets and Native American reservations are some of the worst environmental devastations in this particular country, in the United States, right? And this particular graph shows us that, right? Let's look at another case of California. I'm sorry. Now here, if you look at the sewer lines, right, and now look at the Hispanic population. This is about the Hispanic population, which is mostly towards the city limit on the south or far up in the north, right? And you have the sewer lines, different diameters, as in how crowded the places, how dense the places, but it is very well away from the predominant Hispanic population. Let's get to the energy part of it right now. Let's get to the street lighting, and this is the case of Modesto, California again. Look at where the street lights are concentrated, right? Again, towards the city center. Far, the southeast corner here, you barely see any yellow dots, right? And that shows that there are barely any lights here. Like you look at the corner here, the red, it's red. It is predominantly Hispanic population. This is predominantly Hispanic. This is Hispanic. This is Hispanic Southwest. but there's barely any city lights there, right? So these, the far east, you can argue that it is outside city limits, but this is well within city limits, right? So this shows how, based on race, based on color, there is a discrimination. So there is a particular section of society which is getting affected more because of a choice being made. The question which we need to ask right now is, do we have, not in terms of color, can we raise the same concerns in India, or can we research about this in India? Is particular section of the society, whether in terms of income, whether in terms of gender, whether in terms of caste, is getting disproportionately affected more because of environmental pollution, or is not getting enough benefits of the ways we are generating our energy? Now, to look at, so we've been looking at the historical trends, right? Now let's connect this to the COVID, right? So and this is where the social theories become very important. What I'm arguing right now here is to use social theories of justice, environmental justice, to formulate the way we do our research, to formulate the way we study, or to formulate how we make policies, right? So we have seen the theories of justice. We have seen the environmental justice case based on those social theories. But does that theory apply to the current case of COVID-19? And this is the data which I pulled up day before yesterday from CDC, which is Center for Disease Control here in the United States, which is responsible for collecting, collating all the data, doing vaccines. It's a well-respected organization globally. Look at the numbers here. So an Alaskan native person, which the indigenous person here, is 5 times more likely than a non-white person to get COVID. And a black person at the rate which we're going right now is again 5 times more likely than a white person to get COVID-19, right? Now, this again builds up to the graph which I was showing you, right? Being deprived of clean air. Can it be correlated to being deprived of clean environment? Can it be studied through social theories, right? A Hispanic or a Latino person can be affected 4 times more than a white person, right? A non-Hispanic white person. So we clearly see that there is a disproportionate effect based on the race, based on, in particular case of United States, right? So the case of India, we do have studies in India which talks about environmental justice, right? So because I come from Uttarakhand, as in from Missouri, and this is one thing which is very close to my heart because my relatives fought in this one, and this was like very famous Chipko Andolan in 1978, where women were surrounded themselves with the trees when there was cutting of the forest going on in India, right? And this is a very seminal movement in the historical context and very contemporary history. Now, this can be considered as a justice movement in this particular context because it was led by women, and it was done in 1970s, like especially in the current context, 40 years back. And why is it important is because, for example, if we see the trajectory from there, right? So estimated 40 million people in India has been displaced by large dams in the last 50 years, right? Because in India, we're still developing, right? So we need more electricity, we need more energy. We are energy starving nation right now. So we build a lot of hydropower plants, right? So because of the hydropower plants, a lot of displacement happens, right? And then there are a lot of laws which governs how the people should be compensated, what land should be given, what should not be given. I'm not getting into that detail, but again, the point I'm trying to make is, so when people are displaced, right, is there one particular section of people which is getting affected more? For example, if you own a land where that land is being taken by the government for building a hydropower plant, you'll probably get money for it. You'll probably get another land for it, depending on what the rule of law says. But imagine if you don't have a land there, right? You live there, you're a labor worker, you're working there, you farm there, but now all of a sudden that land is gone. So your means of production is gone, your means of livelihood is gone, and you might not get as big of a compensation because you don't own the land, right? Because of how our laws has been formulated. So, and I'm not getting into details, but I'm talking about the principles as in how we can inculcate that this disproportionate effect which is there in our society. So from this, let's go more towards the energy justice part, right? So what I'm trying to do now is, after introducing the theories, I'm trying to apply those theories in different contexts, seeing if they make sense. So we did it on environmental justice context in US, a little bit in India. Then we looked at the COVID scenario currently, again using justice, and now shortly I'll work on energy justice, as in how it'll imply there, effect there, and then we'll end towards the conclusion part. Now, energy justice, I personally argue, is at the helm, and even more important at times than environmental justice, because environmental injustice is one of the predominant reasons of environmental injustice is the way we generate our energy, and the way we generate our energy, how we generate our energy, and it's not just about generation. It is about the means of production. It is about the services. It is about consumption of energy. And arguably, even today, when we are talking about so much about renewable energy, we are talking so much about going green. Still, 40% of electricity of our electricity is being generated through coal, and this is just electricity. We're not talking about transportation at all, which is predominantly dependent on fossil fuels. Like 97% of the transportation globally is dependent on fossil fuels, right? Energy is at the helm, is at the core of justice or justice when we study environment. But the thing to smile about here is that it is a very new topic. Energy, environmental justice has been around for the last 50, 60 years, has been studied for the last 50, 60 years, and energy justice, as per my understanding, is on the literary end, in terms of research, in terms of academics, has only come into evidence in the last 12 years or so, right? The last paper was in 2008, which specifically talks about energy justice, applying justice theories to it, right? So this is what I was talking about, energy injustice or justices. It is not just about generation. It is about how we extract our resources, how we process them, right? So for example, if more money is going into uh, you all must have heard, like, and I heard it too when I was like 16 or 18, that oil will run out in next 50 years, right? And still we are hearing the same, that the oil will run out in next 50 years, but for some reason the oil is not running out, or the coal is not running out. And it is not running out because when we say oil is running out, we say with the estimates of the extractive resources which we have available now, the proven reserves of oil or coal which we have present today. But because we are pouring so much money into research to find more oil, to find more fossil fuels, we keep increasing the timeline of finding the oil and the coal, right? So it is about where we put our money in, where we are doing conducting research. So it is about extraction, processing, transport, and again disposal, right? And the disposal part is where the environmental justice and injustice comes into play. Now, again, this is just a revision of what I was talking about earlier, right? You have the theories of justice, you apply those theories of justice here. So, for example, in case of energy justice, the context changes, right? Now, and I'll talk about the Indian context after a couple of slides, right? So, we are talking about five main arguments here. So, one is the cosmopolitan justice, right? This is universal right. Right now in India, the policy of as, and I think I'll speak this in Hindi, right? Roti, kapda, and makan, right? That's how the food, uh, housing, and clothes, right? So this is how the slogan which we have heard like long back, right? But and this is how we have evolved in India, right? So now we didn't have any major famines in India after we got independence, right? Because our policy was oriented towards food. Back in old days, the houses didn't get electricity in India, right, in 1960s and 70s, but there was electricity for irrigation, right? That's how the rural India was electrified at first phase. The electricity went for irrigation because our focus was towards food, it was towards housing, and that's how we can all see today. We all want to build a house and own a house, right? But let's think it from the energy perspective. Can we do anything today without electricity, right? We cannot have this webinar in India. So a village in India where there is no electricity right now, and fortunately in India, technically there's electricity everywhere now. We cannot have this webinar in that village, right? If there is a power cut right now, the knowledge constraint is there. We cannot have vaccines stored in a village where there is no electricity. So electricity fundamentally becomes a very important component for us to function in today's world, right? So can we consider electricity as a human right? as a universal right, in fact, right? This is one of the questions. The second one is the distributive justice, right? How do we distribute? Is it all, it depends on money? Like if the people who own can pay for electricity, should only they get electricity, right? And again, the generation of how the electricity should be generated. Should it, if it is coal, if it is cheap, should we burn that? In India, we are generating 75% of electricity using coal right now, right? So it is not very green. And then about the procedure which we are following to approve carbon-based power plants, both inside and both in rural and urban India, and the environmental justice. And in this particular context, I consider environmental justice as part of energy justice and the utilitarian theory, right? So, should we focus on the greater good for the greatest number of people, right? So, what path and what combination of policies should be studied? So, for example, this is a case of Gujarat, right? This is not the power plant which was recently inaugurated by our Honorable Prime Minister, but this is like an older still relatively new, like in 2015, but still an older one. So, it is one of the largest power plants in India. Not the largest, but one of the largest power plants in India, right? So, now we all would be thinking, oh, the solar energy, right? So, it is green, it is not harmful, it is helping us getting out of the cycle of carbon based electricity. But there is it all so good, right? What if I would have to look into the negative side of it as an academician, as a researcher, if I were to look in the social context? Because everything we do is for the society, right? Everything we do is for people. Like this power plant is there for the society. So are there any negative effects of this power plant to the society which were not taken into consideration while building this power plant? So one of the consideration thing which was not taken into consideration, or to some extent was taken into consideration, was the people. So this was based in Gujarat, and this most part of this power plant was built in government land. So right, it was government land, and the research which was done by Yeneti and Day in 2015 pointed out that the villagers there who didn't own their land there, like they used to send their cattle to graze in those land, and of course the land was owned by government, and they used to grow their crops there in those particular lands. Now technically the government didn't do anything wrong technically, right? Because it's government owned land, it's solar power plant, it's green energy, and it is a perfect place because it is not disturbing the human settlements directly. But still, because there was one particular community, right? And the paper points out the case of caste stratification system in that particular village, right? So in that particular, there was a section of the community which used that government land to graze their animals, to grow their crops, right? But now that land is gone, right? So now the first place was built on that land. Now that land is gone, and now that particular community is displaced. Now because they don't own any land, the means of livelihood is gone, right? So this is what we would call as a case of distributive injustice academically, right? And now as a researcher and then the policy makers, how can we address this particular issue, right? Because just after all, we all are citizens of India. We all are citizens of this country. So how do we keep this injustice away? And as we all know, a predominant population in India doesn't own land, or even if they own it, it's not a lot of land, right? So how do we address this particular case? Even when, so we can see that even when it is a very novel case of building solar power plant, there still can be cases of injustices, right? Which would be affecting people, right? So this is one of the ways how we should be targeting the systemic challenges which we are facing in policy making, right? I was talking about the energy justice case in India. I already gave example of that, right? So predominant population of India still lives in rural India. India would become eventually an urban economy, which United States is. So the interesting fact about the US here is that 97% of the US population lives in 3% of the US land, right? It is so urban. And I think we're heading in the same direction in India and with the population rise. And this is where I was talking about the basic good. Can electricity be considered as basic good? It just in the lines with food, in the lines with housing, and in the lines with clothing, right? Because imagine if a person doesn't have electricity in India, or if a village doesn't have electricity in India, how impeding it is to their growth. And still, and these are official figures, like 304 million people are without electricity in India. So in India, all the villages are electrified now, as in they have an electricity connection, but not every house has an electricity connection in India yet. Right, and these figures get updated daily because Indian government is working on it. So this 304 million would have come down now, and 500 million people are still using biomass. This is the case of environmental injustice, which is affecting a particular gender, which is women, because women go and collect firewood and then cook food for the household, and they stay in the kitchen. So it is disproportionately affecting women and adolescent girls, like a clear case of environmental injustice. And now I'm coming towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just reiterating the fact of basic goods, and we need to think of energy and electricity as a means. So, for example, electricity is not an end. For example, if my house gets electricity, it doesn't mean anything if I don't have a bulb, right? Electricity in my house doesn't mean anything if I don't have a refrigerator. Electricity is just a means to the end, right? I might have an electricity in my office right now, but if I don't have a laptop, I cannot do this webinar, right? So we need to see electricity as a means in the same sense as we see water, air, and food. We need food to get energy. If we just have food and we not eat it, it's of no use, right? So we need to see electricity in the sense of it's a means to get things done, right, towards an end, right? And as an instrumental good, which is very important, if not as important as water and food, but definitely after that, right? So we have to think it in a way of that it is a means to achieving in it. And I just included this slide to show that, and I think Honorable Justice has mentioned this as well. It is not about just our generation. There is a temporal dimension to it. So the global warming which we are facing today is because of the carbon dioxide which was emitted during industrial revolution in late 19th century, because the life of carbon dioxide in atmosphere is 200 years. So the emissions which we are actually doing right now are not going to affect us right now. They will affect us not directly. They affect us directly even after 150 years we have emitted them, right? So that is the temporal dimension of justice, and that's how our policy making should be. Like it should be forward looking and not backward looking or current looking. I'll skip the slide for now. And this just gives the examples of few energy injustices problem, which we can study in the context of India or in any geographical or spatial context, and look at how it has been targeted, right? So for example, how is the access to fuels, like whether it is carbon-based fuels, non-carbon-based fuels, the impact of solid fuels, the biomass, wood, on a particular section of the society, energy services which we are getting in rural and urban India. Is there a rural-urban divide in providing electricity access? And why is it? Like, is it just because money, or are there other societal constraints involved in it, right? How the profits distributed, right? Why is electricity a power plant which is based in rural India doesn't supply electricity to the urban India, but doesn't supply electricity to its neighboring village? Do we have those cases in India, right? And I think we do. So this is what we need to study academically, which gives us a direction to the policymakers on in which direction the policy should be formulated, right? And then we have the case of energy costs, like is it disproportionately targeted towards any section, and appliance and infrastructure. And to target this, we have at the global level, the UN level, we have sustainable development goals. And I won't go into details for this particular slide because I know Ms. Rana is speaking after me, and she's an expert when it comes to sustainable development goals and UN goals, having founded SCEHA and been to a lot of UN conferences and negotiated for the government, with the government, and sometimes even critiquing the government. So she'll get into the details of sustainable development goals, hopefully, and this is one at the global level, how we can target or are targeting towards reducing injustices, right? And this is potentially my last slide, which talks about the research potential for us as academicians and for the environmental cell, which they can look into, right? So we can, if we can use Western, non-Western justice philosophies, because right now we've been focusing a lot more on Western theorists and arguing for and against those theories. But as we know, the context of India is very different from the context of United States or Europe, for that matter, right? So can we use our non-justice philosophies of Vedanta, of Gita, and then apply them in the context of environment? Can we learn from those seminal works, right? So that is something which we can look into for research. And then how we can feed in from the, learn from the current pandemic which we all are facing, and apply that so that it doesn't happen again, or it doesn't affect in the state which is it is affecting us right now. And so the idea here is to collate and bring together the social theories to formulate the policy making and the law, right? So the law and public policy making, I think we would all agree here, are very closely interlinked with each other, if not the same, right? So, and as Equinus posted, right? And I love to read this quote, right? It is, as long as we can critically think and any of the judgment, we can critically think any of the argument, it is very important for us to grow. Like then only we can grow. The future lies if we can critically think and based on the reasons of what we have learned, and basically if we can learn and unlearn our knowledge. So that will be all from my side. Thank you so much, and please address if you have any questions. And if we are running out of time, please feel free to email me if there are any questions or concerns. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for those words of wisdom. Now, for the day, Ms. Karuna Rana ma'am. Ms. Karuna ma'am is a Mauritian environmental activist, social entrepreneur, and a community organizer. She has done her master's in environmental and energy policy from Michigan Technological University as the Fulbright Scholar, and is a bachelor in chemical and environmental engineering. Currently working on blue carbon impact and policies with Lollywear, the world's leading seaweed-based material technology company replacing single-use plastic. Ma'am is one of the co-founder of a non-profit organization, SYAH, the only regional organization which convenes young people across 8 African and Asian small island developing states. SYAH has been able to spread awareness of climate change and ways to combat it in nations with limited resources and infrastructure. Some of the initiatives taken up by SYAH are Seeing Blue, the flagship project of Port Louis Hub of Global Sphere Community, Tap Water Revolution, a project to increase to save tap water, village reducing plastic pollution across all sectors in Mauritius. Prep for COP, the flagship project of the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network, and SYAH to increase the effective engagement of young people from the most climate vulnerable countries within UNFCCC. Ma'am has coordinated the participation of youth with key UN negotiation. She is former coordinator of the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network, editor of 5th Global Environment Outlook for Youth publication. Ma'am is recipient of several prestigious honors that are Queen's Young Leader Award in year 2015 and Mary Robinson Climate Justice in Blue in 2016. We would now request Ms. Karuna Rana ma'am to address the attendees. Ma'am, please.
Thank you so much, Ayush. I hope everyone can hear me while I try to share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I'd like to especially thank Dr. Bhageshri Deshpande of the Bharat Vidyapeeth New Law College University for organizing this conference and having invited me. I'd also like to thank all the professors and staff and students, of course, especially of the Environment Cell, who have worked really hard to put together this. I'm very aware of the hard work you put in. So I am really excited to share my perspectives on this topic, especially after having heard from Mr. Shadul Tiwari, who is also one of my colleagues. And I think he beautifully talked about, the social justice aspect of social justice aspect in theories that can be borrowed and applied into environment and energy justice. So I think it fits in really well because I come from a totally different perspective, and I would be talking from two main perspectives. So firstly, when we talk about justice, I'll be talking as a young person from a small island developing state like Mauritius. So for a country like Mauritius, which I said is a small island developing state, or we usually call it SIDS, which is a very specific grouping by the United Nations, we only contribute to 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And when I say we, it's not just Mauritius, it's all the small island developing states across the world, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, so all of them together, less than 1%. And yet we are at the front line of climate change impacts. So firstly, I would be addressing it as that young person from small island developing states. And secondly, I'll be talking of justice as a practitioner who's worked in the area of environmental justice for almost 10 years now, especially having co-founded the nonprofit SIA. So based on these two perspectives, I hope by the end of what I'll be telling you, or rather what we call it speech, I hope by the end I'll be able to do two things for you. Firstly, introduce you to ocean justice. Because when we talk about the environment, we very often talk about a lot of things, but not really the ocean. And where I come from, the ocean is really important. So firstly, we're going to talk about the ocean and ocean's justice. And secondly, this is something that I'm also super passionate about, is I'll be sharing about what can be your role as a student or any person listening to us as a normal citizen. What could be your role in making sure that the environment justice is prevailed? So we're going to move on to the next slide. So I just shared this image because, as you can see, when we're talking about environment, it's literally everything. We're talking about the trees, the mountains, the water, and especially also the oceans. And this is what I was telling earlier, that very often we forget about the ocean, despite it being 70% of our Earth. I thought I'd share a picture of where I come from to put some context as to why I'm so deeply passionate about the ocean. So as you can see on the left, this is a picture from Mauritius. Yes, it's a very touristy place. We do have a lot of Indians who come and visit. I'm sure you've heard of it or seen it in Bollywood movies. But for Mauritius, the ocean is not, it's just more than what you see. For us, it's a very strong economic pillar. It's a very strong social pillar. It's also a very strong cultural pillar. And that's why you can see the next picture that I put is me with one of my very good friends, scuba diving. This was literally my first scuba dive. And one of the things that happened to me when I scuba dived is I got to learn more about the ocean by being in the ocean. So when you are talking about, protecting the environment, protecting nature, I think it's important for you to be in nature, for you to feel how it is, but also for you to see what's all happening, all the beautiful sides of it. I saw amazing biodiversity under the ocean, but also to see the negative impacts that's happening. So this is a bit about, how I came to be super passionate about the ocean. Now, as I said, the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and it contains 97% of its water. However, more than 95% of the depths of the water column and the seabed remain largely unexplored. Some people have even said that we know more about the moon than we know about our own ocean. So why is ocean important? Just to set context, besides being 70% of the Earth. Food. So firstly, fish is a primary source of animal protein for more than 3.1 billion people worldwide, and a lot of these people live in developing countries. In fact, for small island countries like Mauritius, fish can account for up to 90% of the protein in our diet. Secondly, livelihoods. More than 3 billion people rely on the ocean for their livelihoods, again, with a vast majority living in developing countries. Ocean-based industries such as fisheries and tourism are critical providers of employment and income. And this is where I also want to, share some context. A lot of small island countries like Mauritius and Seychelles, and even small islands in the Caribbean, the government have developed a blue economy roadmap. Given how important oceans are for the development of small island states, governments have come up with very comprehensive roadmaps of how can they I wouldn't want to use the word exploit, but this is what a lot of governments are currently doing. How can we, exploit some of the resources in the ocean? And that's where, we, the ones who care about environment justice and ocean justice, are a little concerned that while we want to move forward and develop the country, we don't want to do this at the cost of the ocean that we so much love. But despite everything, the ocean still means a lot to us in terms of livelihoods. And that is something that we cannot change. And then also protection. Oceans are very important because coastal habitats such as mangroves, seagrass, and coral reefs protect the coast against storm waves and flooding. So these storms that come to us, and we do get a lot of them in Mauritius, thanks to these coastal habitats, are able to save lots of lives, property, and is also worth billions of dollars each year in terms of how much is protected and saved. Our ocean also provides key cultural services such as inspiration, cultural identity, sense of home, and even spiritual experience. This is very important for someone like me who comes from a small island state. We often tend to take the ocean for granted, even if we live around it. But anytime if you are feeling low about something, a walk on the beach or a quick swim really helps brighten the day. So it also provides recreation opportunities which help us maintain a good mental and physical health. And finally, the most important part, which a lot of people are not really aware of, is that oceans regulate our climate and absorb almost 1/3 of global carbon dioxide emissions. So this is really big because we have coastal ecosystems such as wetlands and mangroves and seaweed that can absorb up to 20 times more carbon dioxide than land-based forests, and even aid with climate change adaptation. So since we're talking about this, I'd like to share that some of the work I'm doing with Lollyware, which is a startup, and they are making plastic alternatives out of seaweed. And why seaweed? So we chose to work with seaweed because of this term that we use, which is blue carbon. So what is blue carbon? I mean, when we talk about saving the environment, very often we think about planting trees. And why do we want to plant trees? Because trees absorb carbon dioxide. So let's call the carbon dioxide that the trees absorb a green carbon. Well, coastal ecosystems like seaweed, mangroves, wetlands, they do the same that trees do, but in the ocean, and they can do it up to 20 times more. And they can even do it faster than trees. So this is something that the international community is starting to recognize only recently. And a lot more countries will be talking about blue carbon and not just tree planting or saving our forests, which are also important. But all of this will be integrated together. So this is why, again, to sum up, oceans are so very important for us. However, the health of the ocean is at very big risk, which means that the well-being and health of our planet and humans is at grave risk too. We're talking of 70% of our planet. And I just told you how important it is for our livelihoods and food and everything else. So if the oceans are not well, we won't be either. And this is why it's not well. This is all what's happening. So on one hand, we have climate change. As I said, the oceans are absorbing carbon dioxide. But at what cost? I mean, the ocean can only absorb so much. If it exceeds its capacity to absorb carbon dioxide, definitely the ocean then gets acid. acidic, and then the coral reefs are affected. In turn, fishes are affected, and a lot of other marine habitats are affected. So indirectly, they're affecting our food, our livelihoods, and then of course, there is a sea level rise that is linked to climate change and very, very scary for small island states like Mauritius. And then we also have a lot of overfishing and destruction. So we are taking out more fishes than what the sea can provide us back with. And this is going to be very damaging in terms of the future of food. But when we talk about destruction, there's also the destruction in terms of seabed mining, for example. We're trying to exploit, what are the minerals in the ocean without thinking of the impact that it's going to have on the marine life. And then there's also oil spills and marine pollution. Now, this topic about global governance of the environment in the pandemic era, Justice Goel was very right in mentioning that while we were locked down and some of us are still locked down, the environment was breathing. But unfortunately, we cannot be locked down forever. And this is very interesting to have a talk like that during the pandemic, because what's happening with the pandemic is all of a sudden a lot of UN meetings, a lot of negotiations around the environment have been postponed. And a lot of news about the environment are also not being given enough attention. A lot of you might not be aware that there was a very big oil spill that happened in the north of Russia just a couple of months ago, I think. And I think 20,000 tons of diesel oil were spilled in the ocean and are moving very quickly to the Arctic. And because of the pandemic, and there is so much news around coronavirus, especially, it's crazy that we're not able to focus on the other things that are happening in the environment, good and bad. So this is why definitely there is this pandemic era where environmental issues are not being given enough attention. So meetings like these are very important to talk about them. So coming back to what I was talking about, what's going on with the ocean, oil spills, as I said, marine pollution, it's not just oil spills. There's a lot of pollution coming from agriculture runoff that enters the ocean. A lot of hotels are also, throwing in their wastewater, which also contains a lot of oil into the oceans. And from what I was reading, around 80 to 90% of marine pollution actually comes from land. And this is also an area where we need to be focused on, land and marine. They cannot be viewed separately because a lot of pollution is coming from there. And speaking of pollution, of course, a lot of you might be, I'm sure, aware of this, but plastic marine debris. We've heard about this. We've seen it, everywhere around us. And it's scary to think that by 2050, there might be more plastics in the ocean than fishes, if we don't take action, of course. And at the moment, again, with the pandemic, plastics are increasing because safety comes first now. And all of a sudden, we're using more plastic, even the mask. And there have been a lot of reports that are showing that a lot of these waste are ending up in the environment, in our ocean. So now we've, talked about the importance of the ocean and what's happening with it. Let's talk a bit about the governance side of it. So international ocean governance, what's going on? And I'll be talking about some of the emerging governance issues and, developments that are happening on that front. So the first thing to understand is the system for ocean governance is extensive and complex. As extensive and complex as our ocean is. That's very reflective of that. So at the heart of the international governance is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, so the UNCOLS. So that is the main international government agreement that exists for the ocean, and it was adopted in 1982. So the convention entered into force in 1994 and is ratified by 168 states to date. Is the only legal framework for all the activities in the oceans and sea. Some of the key provisions of UNCLOS are maritime zones. I'll be sharing a slide after this, which will explain you a bit about, maritime zones, how, even the ocean is divided into certain areas, and it's very important to understand what those areas are. So the convention lays them out. And then there's also provisions on the rights of passage and navigation. Of course, when we talk about the ocean, how can we forget the transport and the shipping industry, which travels across the ocean a lot? There's also peace and security of oceans and seas, which are very crucial for certain areas, including the Indian Ocean. And then, of course, the conservation and management of marine living resources, protection and preservation of the marine environment, marine scientific research. Now, this is very key. As I said, we might know more about the moon than we know about the ocean. And if we are thinking of protecting the ocean, the first thing we need to know is what exactly is in there, and to what extent can we protect it, and to what extent it is damaged. So a lot more scientific research needs to be done. A lot more data needs to be collected on the ocean, the good and the bad, for us to know what we're dealing with, and also to know what are the other ocean services we could sustainably benefit from. For example, we're slowly starting to find out, as I told you, about blue carbon and the importance of seaweed and seagrasses. We're also starting to find out the medicinal properties that could come from the ocean. A lot of countries already use that. And there's also the dispute settlement procedures, because the ocean, even if it's like large and for everyone, well, there are certain jurisdictions. Some nations have certain areas that fall under their jurisdiction. So that's also important to highlight in the convention of how this is disputed in terms of those things, but also the resources in the ocean in those areas. So the next slide is very important to understand, especially when we're talking about ocean governance. So if you look at this, and I'm moving my cursor, if you look at this from the left to right, so you have on the left, I would say, more of the mainland. So, you have the internal waters, the coastal baseline, the territorial sea, and this very important area called the exclusive economic zone. So these areas, and also the continental shelf, so these areas mainly fall under country jurisdiction. That means they're managed by those countries, and they have right over the resources in it. However, you will see there is this other area. Oops. There is this other area called the high seas. And those are areas which are beyond any national jurisdiction. And these areas are almost half of the ocean. So you can imagine an area, as the size as half of the ocean, with a lot of resources and biodiversity, which really don't have any national jurisdiction, really don't have any solid protection mechanisms. So a lot of it is left, very uneven. And this is, one of the biggest areas that ocean governance is currently working on. So as you can see, this is how the maritime zone is divided. And then I also wanted to quickly show this graph of the UN clause and the different agencies that work under it. It's a lot for you to digest, but some of the key ones are the United Nations Environment Program, of course. There is the Intergovernmental Oceanic Commission. IMO is important, the International Maritime Organization. FAO, to do with fisheries and food. So yeah, just for you to get an idea of the different agencies that work together with UN Plus. And now I will be talking about Sustainable Development Goals. As my colleague, Mr. Tiwari, earlier said, yes, I have worked heavily on Sustainable Development Goals, and he did show a very good picture of that. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So just to put a context to Sustainable Development Goals, they came into being and they were adopted by the UN in 2015. So before that, I'm not sure if you've heard, but there was the Millennium Development Goals that were a set of goals put together by the UN with different indicators in terms of different areas like health and environment, which different countries had to achieve within a certain time frame. Unfortunately, a lot of the targets were not achieved by the countries. That's one problem. And the second problem is that there were only 7 Millennium Development Goals, I think it was 7, but it was very less. And a lot of the sustainable development issues were not included in that. For example, we did not have a goal on oceans. We had a goal on environment as a whole, but not on oceans. We did not have a goal separately for sustainable production and consumption. We didn't have a goal specifically for climate change. And these are areas that, even if they're linked, they need to be treated separately at the same time. And they need to have their separate goals for us to be able to successfully manage them. So this is why the Sustainable Development Goals came into being, and there are 17 of them. And it's interesting to also note, and this is important for everyone listening, which is I'll be talking more about advocacy later. So what's your role as a young person or as a citizen when it comes to governance and policy making? So a story behind this is also that, I have been involved in the process of developing the Sustainable Development Goals when the UN decided that we should have them. And the UN was still working with the governments in terms of, how many goals should we have? What should the goals be? And a lot of young people, especially small island developing states young people, we went to the UN meetings. We continuously lobbied with government saying that we need a separate goal for oceans. We even lobbied to have a separate goal for young people. We didn't get it, but at least we got the oceans. But so lobbying and advocacy is important, and that's some background story to it. But coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, I just wanted to share that this is also very important in terms of global ocean governance. So these are some of the targets related to the ocean. Reducing marine pollution, managing ecosystems, minimizing ocean acidification, ending overfishing, conserving at least 10% of coastal and marine areas, prohibiting certain form of fishery subsidies, and increasing the economic benefits to small island developing states and least developed countries from the sustainable use of marine resources. So these are some of the targets. As you can see, some of them are actually for this year. And from what I've read, a lot of them are not on track to be met. And I'm pretty sure with the pandemic happening and coronavirus, it's further delaying things. So this is very important to understand when we're talking about global ocean governance. No single country or industry can solve any of the ocean challenges alone, and their magnitude reflects the need for urgent and concerted action by policymakers and industry leaders. I am going to focus on 3 emerging issues for global ocean governance that are currently being looked at and discussed. So the first one is climate change. As I've put into context before, climate change is impacting the ocean, but at the same time, the ocean has the capacity to impact the way we deal with climate change. So in the past, when it came to environmental governance and negotiations to do with climate change and oceans, they have been kept separate. And it is only last year in the UN climate change negotiations, the 25th COP meeting, that they started placing a lot more significance on oceans. It was talked before in previous conferences, but not significantly addressed. And since this has been addressed in the last conference, we are seeing a lot more discussion on stuff like ocean-based climate change mitigation and adaptation targets. Now, what do I mean by ocean-based climate change mitigation and adaptation targets? So on one hand, we have the target of keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, as mentioned by the Paris Agreement. But on the other hand, what can be the role in tackling climate change? What can be the role of the ocean? So as I mentioned earlier, blue carbon is one. We have the coastal ecosystems like seaweed, seagrass, wetlands that need to be restored, that need to be planted even more so that they can absorb more carbon dioxide and help tackle climate change. But at the same time, when we talk about the ocean, there is also the potential for marine energy. Which is really big. And again, coming back to seaweed and energy, seaweed, as I mentioned, is being used for blue carbon. The company that I work with, they are using it for a new form of bioplastic. But seaweed is also being considered as biofuel. There has been a lot of research that has been done on the potential of seaweed as biofuel. And it seems like a lot of the research that has been done is now coming together and will be scaling up. So we're going to see seaweed also being used as biofuel. And this is what I meant by ocean-based climate change mitigation and adaptation targets. But when we talk about adaptation, so mitigation is, fighting climate change, reducing emissions, but how do we adapt to the effects already? And again, coastal ecosystems like seaweed and wetlands, they not just absorb carbon dioxide, but they also help with ocean acidification, with improving water quality, and helping the marine habitats stay alive and healthy. So that's one. The second emerging ocean governance issue, I would say, is ocean plastics pollution. So at the moment, despite us talking a lot about ocean pollution and countries banning it, there is a big legal gap in the ocean governance structure relating to marine plastic litter and microplastics. There is currently no legally binding instrument dedicated to tackling marine plastic pollution, no agreed pollution reduction targets, no agreed safe plastic production rules, no globally agreed standards for reporting and monitoring of plastics discharge, and effectiveness of pollution reduction measures. So these are, I'm talking at the global level. We're hearing, okay, we need to do this, but no legally binding instrument yet, no concrete targets. However, the good news is that this could change, because in December 2017, in the UN Environment Assembly, they did establish an ad hoc, open-ended expert group to make recommendations to strengthen international governance structures for combating marine plastic litter and microplastics. It's very important to distinguish between the two. So marine plastic litter is, for example, as you can see in the background picture, all the plastic that ends up in the ocean. But then there is also microplastics, which, as the name suggests, is super, super small and not even sometimes visible by the human eye, but they have been found they have been found in the table salt, in even drinking water. And there were also research showing that small pieces of plastic are even being found in new babies, like babies being born. So it's really worrying. And this is why there's a lot of talk about microplastics, because once they end up in the ocean or on the beach, they break down into very small pieces and stay there forever. And the last thing, in terms of, the big emerging issue in terms of ocean governance globally, is biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So if you remember the chart that I showed you on the maritime zone, the way it's divided, I did tell you that there is an area that doesn't fall under any national jurisdiction. And that area is super important. So as I said, it's 64% by area, 95% by volume. Those areas are often referred to as high seas, and they host a wide array of ecosystems and species. But there is no law to meaningfully address its biodiversity monitoring and conservation in high seas. Again, the good news is that the UN General Assembly in 2017 voted to convene a multi-year process to develop a treaty on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this was to happen this year, in 2020. So the treaty was being drafted, and the final draft was almost ready, and the meeting was supposed to happen this year, but because of the coronavirus and pandemic, it had to be moved. But it is being worked upon, and hopefully by next year we will see a solid treaty on this, and all the areas of the sea will be protected. Now, I've talked a bit about, the ocean, and I've hopefully made you understand how important the oceans are when we talk about global environmental governance. I just wanted to share quickly, what you can do, because you've learned a lot, and you must be asking yourself, okay, what can I do besides, taking the learning and all of that? What can I do as a young person? So before I tell you what you can do, I just quickly wanted to talk about environmental policy making tools, because it's important for you to understand how policy is designed. So just to give you an example, think about what is one environmental issue you care about, and think about an environmental policy that you would use to tackle it. I'm sure you're thinking of, very big policies like, banning plastics if it's plastic pollution for you, or 100% renewable energy if you care about energy. Well, when it comes to policy making, I want to let you know that it can happen at different levels. So there is the international level policy, the regional level, the national level, state level, corporate, household, and individual. And I gave an example using plastic pollution that, besides all the regional and national and state level that we talk about, you could also be working in a corporate sector, and your company can, ban plastics in your company, just the way Starbucks did. Or you can be, within your household, and your family decides that they don't want to use PET bottles anymore. So that's a household level policy you're taking. Or you can decide to lead a plastic-free lifestyle. So that's an individual level policy. So I just want to let you know that policy happens at all levels, and we can all be policymakers. But moving back to the bigger level of policy making, which is important for us to know and influence, just quick background: what is environmental policy? It's a principle of action adopted or proposed by government, party, business, or individual to achieve a rational outcome. How a policy can look like: it can be a statement of intent. So a company saying that I intend to do this, or it can be a specific set of proposals, such as a manifesto. It can be proposals authorized by government and parliament, such as legislations. They could be proposals backed by resources, such as funding and staffing, which is a policy program. Or it can just be the outcomes of a decision. How a policy is developed: there is the policy preparation stage, where you need to know what are the issue you're tackling. Then there is the policy formulation, where you study and recommend, and it's very important to include other stakeholders in it, and stakeholders like us, the civil society, the academics, young people. We need to be involved in the policy formulation. Then there is the policy adoption and legitimization. That's the legal aspect of it. Then there is the policy implementation, monitoring and reviewing it. And then there is the assessment to make sure that it's working. And this is just a circle of policies. Very quickly, what are the different types of policy instruments used when it comes to tackling environmental issues? I have divided them into the level of government intervention. So when the level of government intervention is very high, we call this the command and control policy type, which is regulatory in nature. An example is bans. And then we have a mixed, which is a moderate form of government intervention. And the policy types could be market-based. For example, a tax, fee, a subsidy, extended producer's responsibility. Or it could also be financing and investment. For example, investing in infrastructure, R&D investment, so investment into innovation and new technology. And then you have a government intervention that is low. That is education and transparency, for example. So we can have campaigning, certification, and environmental labeling, where the government doesn't make it compulsory, but they kind of propose that you should do that, and companies adopt it. And finally, there are also a level of government intervention which is absolutely zero, and that is to do with voluntary action by corporations. So for example, Starbucks just saying that, okay, we're going to ban plastic straws. That's an example of a voluntary action. Okay, so now that I've talked about, we've talked about the oceans, why they're important, what's happening on the global governance stage, and then I talked about how environmental policies are developed. This is the most exciting bit. What is your role as a citizen who cares? As a young person, as a young student, what is your role? And this is why I want to talk a bit about policy advocacy. How do you advocate for policies that are going to be important for the current generation and the future generation? So what is advocacy? Advocacy is simply championing of a particular cause with the aim of influencing policymakers, stakeholders, or a broad audience. So we're not just talking of policymakers. It could be, as I said, household level. You go and talk to your family members to not use plastic anymore in your house. And that is a form of advocacy. And if you manage to successfully convince them, then you've been successful with your advocacy. So it's not just policymakers. And there are different types of advocacy. One of them can be evidence-based influencing, which very often is used in the academic world. By, for example, you do research and then you publish them. And then there is lobbying. Lobbying is more one-on-one. So let's say I want plastics, banned in Mauritius. So I go in, I take a couple of my colleagues, and we set up a meeting with the Ministry of Environment, and we try and convince him why it's important to ban plastic. So this is more of a one-on-one meeting, so it's lobbying. And then you have the mobilization, campaigning, and activism, which is, for example, you're out shouting on the streets. That's one example. And then there are also projects and entrepreneurship. So you can come up with a green business idea, for example. That's also a form of advocacy, because you're helping influence people and advance the cause. Now, what are the important policy advocacy steps? Let's say you want to change a policy, whether it could be in your university, it could be in the state or the country. First thing you need to know is what you're fighting for. It needs to be very clear. What is the outcome that you want? Second thing, and this is the most important, at least for me, is becoming an expert at it. Because my experience that I've had as a young person who goes and talks to policymaker is, if they see you as a young person, especially if you're a student, or even if you're in academics, they look at you and be like, okay, what do you know about policymaking? What do you know about this topic? For example, I was at a meeting where we were talking about climate change adaptation and mitigation, and this one specific government employee assumed that we don't know what's the difference between adaptation and mitigation. So it's important for us to know our topic, and then when we go and talk to policymakers, for them to take us seriously and know that they're dealing with experts and stakeholders, because we're not just coming in as noisemakers. We're coming in as partners and experts. So definitely do your homework and become an expert at it. And then the third thing is obviously strategize, which I will be talking more about, how to do it, some of these tips and tricks. And then build your network. You can do it alone. If you take the example of Greta Thunberg, which I'm sure you must have heard of, she did start alone, but in the end, she did build a whole network of climate change activists like herself who've been campaigning Fridays for Future all around the world. So you do build your network. And finally, communicate. You communicate as much as you can about the issue. So know what you're fighting for. What's your goal? And when you are talking about your goal, you need to think about, what does victory look like? What is the end point that you want to see? And then you have clear objectives. If you're talking about, okay, let's say you care about energy justice and you want to change, for example, in your state, if they're using this amount of renewable energy, but you want to change the amount of renewable energy used, or maybe you just want, you simply want your school to go, 100% renewable energy, you want them to install solar panels. So what clearly you want, you need to have an exact goal and, the exact objectives, and then how are you going to strategize, which I'll be talking about, what are some of the tactics you'll use, and, who are the people you're going to talk to. So it's very important to first, know that. And here again, you use SMART, which I'm sure you've seen a lot: specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound. This is used in any project management tool. It's also important to use when you're advocating for a cause. So, what are some planning tools? As I said, you need to assess the situation first. Now that you know what you are advocating for, first thing you need to ask yourself is my campaign really needed? Sometimes we are very passionate about something, and maybe we are the only person passionate about it, and maybe there's another cause that is even more serious that is needed. Or maybe you're passionate about something and you haven't read about it, and maybe when you read about it, you realize that the government is actually working on something to advance that cause. So it's important to know if your campaign is needed for yourself, for the society, if it's being worked upon. And then, what are the root causes? That is also important. And I'll be talking about the problem tree. Not just, okay, this is the problem, but try and dig in, what is exactly the problem? For example, I keep referring to plastic pollution because that's the area I work in. Yes, the problem is plastic pollution, but the root cause is not, the pollution itself. The root cause is that we are consuming a lot of it, for example. And then who are the key stakeholders? It's very important to analyze the power dynamics in this. So, diving in more into the situational analysis of things, it's important when you're assessing the situation to assess it politically. So what is the current political situation? Does it relate to any public policy? Economically, can the economic situation influence my campaign? Social, is the society pro or against my goal? Are there some sensitive issues that you need to take into consideration? Technological, are there any tech developments? Legal, are there any laws you need to be aware of? And environmental, any environmental constraints? You can, of course, do the problem tree, which is often, again, used in project management. So which I talked about, what is the problem? What are the root causes and what are the effects? And then this is very important, power analysis. Find out, who's your target? Who are you influencing? If you can find out, not just, okay, the government, maybe go and find out who in the government, is there a specific person? Is it the minister? Is it, do you have to go through the secretary general of the ministry, or maybe an officer that, you could start with and then move to the minister. So you need to know clearly who's your target. And then who are against you and for you. So for example, if I talk about plastic pollution, the people that would be for me, of course, would be, my fellow colleagues in the NGOs. But if you talk about against you, I'm sure the PET bottling companies, the bottled water companies would definitely not be my friends, and they would be against my campaign. But it's important to know who are, who's on your side, who's not. How can you use that into your benefit? Sometimes you can even get people who are against you to, be convinced to some extent. And then you need to keep monitoring and evaluating, keeping track of whether your campaign is working or not, how many people you're impacting, how many people are being convinced, what's the progress. Maybe you need to change the tactics if it's not working, try something else. And then, in the end, it's all about communication. So as human beings, we love sharing stories, and that's how we remember a lot of things about each other. So try and, bring in personal stories, human stories to your campaign. That's really important. And then, we like to call it keeping simple and stupid, but it is actually, that's how people remember it the best. So, when you're communicating to the wider audience about your policy advocacy campaign, it's important to know who's the responsible communicate who's the responsible party. What action do you want people to take? It's the same thing that I'm doing for you. For example, I communicated about the oceans today because that's what I wanted you to care about. But if I leave you without any action, you will be like, okay, it's really sad this is happening with our oceans, but what do you want us to do? Maybe you can go and Google it yourself, but it's also my duty as a campaigner to give you some ideas. So, here we are. It's important to tell people what action they can take. What are some solutions? What are some problems? But also, what will be the benefit? How will people benefit from your campaign? And we all have core values as human beings, and it's important to reach out to your audience and touch upon their core values. So this is how a successful advocacy campaign looks like. It influences many stakeholders. It adopts a set of principles. It relies on evidence and information. It aims for systematic change. And this is very important, you walk the talk. I cannot talk to you about plastic if I'm consuming a lot of plastic myself. It makes me a hypocrite, but also it makes my campaign weak, because if I can't do it, how can I ask other people to do it? So always walk the talk. And I will end with giving you examples of how I conducted policy advocacy back home in my country and in the networks I've worked in, to show you that young people, even in small island states like Mauritius, have come up with successful campaigns and around the world. So you can do it too. First case study is a project called Tap Water Revolution. And we wanted to reduce the use of bottled water and increase access to safe tap water. So what we did is we divided the campaign, the project, into 3 parts. We had the public awareness, which is more of the campaigning bit. And then we had advocacy, where we actually went and lobbied with relevant policymakers and ministers. And then alternatives. So we decided that we just don't want our campaign to be around reduce. Sorry? Okay, and never mind. I'm almost done anyway. So yeah, we don't want the campaign to be just okay, don't use water, but we wanted to provide alternatives. So you know what we did? We actually did not. So we've been telling the governments to install drinking water fountains, and when they were taking a lot of time, we actually installed them ourselves. We talked to a couple of companies who are our partners, and we fundraised money from those companies. We fundraised from the Canada High Commission. So we did our own fundraising, and we installed the drinking water fountains in a couple of public places ourselves. So that's an example of how we took things in our own hand and decided to fight for justice ourselves. And then there is a second project which I'd like to talk about, which is more global, is Prep for COP. So this has to do with the UN climate change negotiations that happen. As I said, climate change, young people from small island states are most vulnerable. But when it comes to these meetings, a lot of them are not aware. Maybe a lot of you might not be aware as well that there is a space for young people to participate in the official UN climate change negotiations. So I've had the chance to attend. The previous speaker, Mr. Tiwari, he had the chance to attend. There is actually, a group for young people, there's a group for women, there's a group for academia, and these are groups that can attend the meeting and contribute to the meeting. They can help shape the negotiations. But how will you do that if you're not aware that it's happening, if you're not aware of the space, but also if you're not trained to use the space? The UN climate change negotiations can be very, very complex. So what we did in our project is we trained young people on understanding the technical aspects of the climate change negotiations. We trained them on how to run campaigns. We trained them on how to communicate. And then we connected them with their government, and we sent a few of them to the UN climate change negotiations. I won't talk about all of that, but some of the impacts we've had, we trained quite a few people. And this is the biggest success story that we've had, which is the government of Seychelles actually included young people in the delegation. And these young people, so as you can see in the picture, they're all young people who are at the UN climate change negotiations on the government delegation. So they are considered as the official government delegation. They are helping the government cover the negotiations and working very closely with policymakers. So that's one success story. And this is the absolute last thing. I've shared all these amazing things about what young people are doing and what you can do. I want to leave you with some networks that I will be happy to share links with you through the organizing team of this conference. So there is the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, which are the official group that participate in the United Nations Sustainable Development negotiations. And then there is the Youth Climate, it's called UNGO, so they are the official youth space in the UN climate change negotiations. So the UN has the climate change negotiations, they have sustainable development negotiations, ocean negotiations. So these are some of the groups that you can join. They work online. They work online a lot. Anyone is allowed to join. There is no, decision-making body. It's open for everyone. It's as much as you want to join and contribute. And if you do that, you actually get access to a lot of the documents of the meeting and you help shape it. So these are some networks. You can also join the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network that I was a former coordinator of, and we're restructuring, and you'll be able to connect with young people from across the Commonwealth who work environmental issues. And then there is also the Indian Youth Climate Change Network. So these are some networks that you can join. And if I have more, I'll be happy to share with that if you message me, or I'll share it with the organizing team. But there's a lot more you can do as environmental lawyers. One thing I always think about when it comes to law is, we talk about justice for humans, but very often we forget about justice for the environment. And they are voiceless in a way. And as a lawyer, for example, tomorrow when you're practicing, you can always do a pro bono case when it comes to environmental issues. So that's another thing you can do as a lawyer in the future. So I have given you a lot of things that you can do, and it is my hope that I have inspired you to take action, but I've taught you also about the importance of the ocean and global ocean governance. If you have any questions and comments, you can contact me. This is my email address. So I thank you, and I wish all of you to have a fruitful meeting in the next hour and tomorrow.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for sharing the treasure of your knowledge and wisdom. It rightfully encapsulated and touched upon all the relevant dimensions, along with empathy as the guiding value. My friend and co-host Ayush shall be dealing with the questions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we proceed to our next session and are joined by a towering figure in the field of environmental conservation, Dr. Philip Francis. Born in 1958, Sir is a renowned mathematician and presently a senior faculty member at Schumacher College at Darlington, United Kingdom. Popularly known as the emissary of change, our guest has actively pursued the cause of environmental conservation on campus and beyond. Showered with awards and appreciation across the world, Sir is a prolific writer and a world-acclaimed author. His mathematical model drawing correlation between environmental degradation and its economic cost has been accepted by the world community at large. We welcome you, sir, in this conference. May we now request you to kindly address this gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite a introduction. I would just try to share my content, and I'd also like to thank very much Dr. Bhagashri Deshpande for organizing it and inviting me, and for the previous speakers who've laid the ground for this conference. So I will just, I think this is the one I need to share. Oh, let me, right, so I hope everybody can hear me and see my screen. So I actually went to New College, so I feel very at home talking at this conference of New Law College. And I thank very much the previous speakers, Shandul and Karuna, for laying a lot of the ground for this debate and for this situation we're in at the moment, where so much of the world has been turned upside down. And it's very hard to know how to direct oneself or orient oneself. And often I find that it's cartoonists or who are able to capture the world situation as it is at the moment much better than commentators or analysts, because it is so kind of divorced as reality from anything we knew before. And so on being able to present at this talk, I immediately looked to a cartoonist to give a view of what is justice in the current age. And I like this cartoon very much because the figure of justice is not blind justice, instead she's wearing a mask. You can see that the birds of prey hovering in the background, and you've got this very unequal balance, which once again is favoring money, capital, property against the human, the ecological, and this kind of epitomizes a much deeper crisis that we're facing. So Shandul in his talk said that he very clearly laid the foundation of what justice used to be. So he said that justice was a system where individuals surrender freedom for a collective good or a collective benefit or a collective system that's able to offer a composite good beyond the individual. And Karuna in her talk gave us ideas how we can use that system in order to promote and find our way and change policy on the environment in this area of crisis. But this cartoon is kind of hinting at a deeper crisis that's underlying where we are at the moment. And in this imbalance that's shown in the diagram, we are shown something that many of us are feeling. Like, if we surrender our freedom, is the government anymore of the modern day really looking after the collective good? Or are they chasing some fantasy of their own kind of imagination or psyche or their party line? And also, we have to ask how is that system, that collective system, working at the moment? Has it enabled us to defeat the pandemic? Has it enabled us to really change our way of life in order to meet the environmental challenge? And we have to answer that even though the legal system, that system of surrender for the collective good, has held our society in progress for the last few hundred years, it is now facing a fundamental challenge to its existence, because it is not clear what the direction for the collective good is at the moment. And so this cartoon is really showing us that underneath all the words about environment, about law, about the system we're in, there is a deeper question. And that is that there is another type of justice, another type of law. And that other type of law is not one where we surrender our freedom in order to engineer a collective good, but it's something where we follow our freedom in order to try to encounter what is at the heart of that freedom, whether it's nature or water or humanity. And for a society to work in harmony, these two aspects of law need to be in balance. And it's very clear from this picture that where we are at the moment, these two are not in balance. That people who are following their freedom, trying to understand water, understand the environment, understand humanity, are not having an equal share, an equal say in steering human way forward. And so in this talk, I would like to concentrate on these two ways of seeing. And I've called these two ways of seeing, so one is regulatory law. So regulatory law is probably what you're all studying at the New Law College. And regulatory law governs by rules which are very clear. They're very causal and clearly delineated. And they say what is right or wrong, because it's working with cases where it's possible to simplify and reduce a situation into something where somebody is doing right, a plaintiff has been wrongly victimized, and so there needs to be some kind of retribution to address the plaintiff, and for the person who's done the wrong to be criminalized. That's probably a very simple way of saying it. But I want to balance that with something I call water law. And water law is about situations which you cannot reduce into right or wrong. You cannot impose an order and say that in this case, this act has created something that is not desirable, and so we want to push it back to a more desirable outcome. So water law governs things like water, and nature, where the freedom of water to go its own way, the freedom of the virus to spread if it's given the opportunity, the freedom of the climate to expand into the space given by carbon emissions. This freedom is something you cannot bring into a court of law and try to control. It's more something that you have to find a balance. You have to try to stop that freedom going into an excess where there are floods, where there are huge climatic events, where there's riots in the streets because of dissatisfaction. But you want to explore that freedom and to know its dynamic in order to bring it back into balance. And this is a quite different skill in humanity, where instead of trying to control something by imposing something, you try to know something in its freedom, and in that you're able to facilitate or moderate or mediate how that quality or that essence acts. And this is the work that we've been doing in the Flow Partnership, which is to try to understand the nature of water and to create interventions in the landscape which can help reduce floods and moderate droughts and create a balanced environment where previously drought-ridden areas can come to life, and huge flood areas like in England in the last few years can be brought back into a natural rhythm where storm events do not lead to terrible and drastic floods. So water is the law I want to talk about today. And yet if I look to Wikipedia, I find this quote. So water resources law, in some jurisdictions shortened to water law, is the field of law dealing with the ownership, control, and use of water as a resource. It is most closely related to property law and is distinct from laws governing water quality. So here we see an immediate problem that water law is something about ownership, control, and use of water. So water law is trying to return water to being a commodity, something we can control, something we can discuss the ownership from and maximize it as a resource, something we can sell, something passive, a commodity. But it's clear from events in the last few years that water is not something we can control. By its very nature, water has an unlimited capacity in the right conditions to aggregate into huge flood events. And it has a huge capacity if you're not looking after the water, if you're taking down the forest, if you're not allowing the water to soak through because of the concrete. It has a capacity for deserting the land and leaving unfarmable arid land in its wake. So the water law I want to talk about is rather to understand the nature of water. What is the law of water? That is not something we can impose, but is something that we have to learn about and understand its dynamic in order to relate to this. And I would say that these two aspects of a law that is about property and static things and a law that is about dynamic quality and relationship, these two aspects have both to be represented, because otherwise, if one or other is overrepresented, then the law will be out of balance. And it is that balance in this time of pandemic that it is so necessary for us to restore. Because when there is balance, it doesn't matter if there are shocks, because the balance will keep the equilibrium. It will keep things relating and in harmony. So here is a Esri map of that even goes round, which is showing the imbalance in the water situation worldwide. So the red areas that you can see are where there is the precipitation is less than the water that is evaporated by vegetation and the water that runs off. So the red areas means these are areas where the local water cycle is not self-sufficient. And it means that water has to be retrieved from the aquifers. So the aquifer levels, that's the level you have to dig a well in order to get water for your crops as a villager, or however you do it, is getting lower and lower. So it might have been 10 feet in India around Pune 10 years ago, now it's 20 feet. So this imbalance where we're no longer looking after water locally, and we're creating this this dependence on the aquifer, we call the global water bank, because it's showing a depletion in some areas and an excess in other areas of the water that we have available to us, and that we're wasting a lot of water through our practices, through our concrete. And if we want to see the consequences of this action, then we can look to we can look to many events around the world. But before going on to those individual events, I just wanted to contrast this idea of water law with general law, with regulatory law. So water law is not showing an individual crime for which someone should be punished. We can't bring somebody into court and say it's your fault that so much water is being wasted and that water is running at a debt in so many countries. In a way, what I've shown you is a universal imbalance, and we are all responsible for it. We cannot limit it to one person who is responsible. And the individual and community measures of this water law have been followed traditionally for millennia as an inner law of harmony. People in indigenous cultures, I mean, India especially for thousands of years, they understood that you had to look after water locally. You had to hold the water when it rains. You needed trees so that the cycle of water that went from the ground to the soil to the evaporation to the cloud forming to the rainfall and back into the soil, that was understood that this was a dynamic quality of how landscapes worked, and you had to put energy and you had to put your understanding and insight into making sure that these measures worked well. And what we're finding more and more is that if we care about water or we do not care about water, then the law of water exerts its own consequence. So the more drought events we see, the more flood events we see that this has nothing to do with the law of who owns what, of who has what property, of which company owns the water, of which fragmented piece of society somebody has the rights and ownership of. This is about something that is unmeasurable, it's unownable. It's a kind of system of a cycle of relationship that if we care about the water, we have a balanced water cycle, the farmland will produce. But if we have an imbalanced water cycle, then we will tend to see more dramatic climate events. And this, of course, is being exacerbated with the rising world temperature because of carbon. But we also see that this lack of basic care about the landscape, which has to come from an inner drive, an inner passion, because we are part of that system, that lack of care is not being looked after and is having its own consequences. So the earth has become the court, and the law is something that the natural law is something that we are standing before. And water is not after the law, it is before the law. Where there is no water, there is nothing. The community creates the law when it establishes its right in water. So we're really finding some hard truths at the moment that we cannot impose our order on the world. The world is showing us its law, its order, its balance that it wants us to follow and to be in. So I'm just so let me just switch very briefly. So here's an area we were busy in 2019, and this shows some interventions in a landscape which I call the Global Water Bank, and the difference you can make when you care for the land and care for water than when you don't. So this is an area that's incredibly dry, and in Rajasthan, and it was known as a bandit area because it was sort of beyond the law. It was so dry, there were no shops, there was no sort of policing, there was no possessions. It was an area that had its own anarchy. And the Flow Partnership and TBS, Taran Bharat Sangh in India, have been working in this area for the last 30 years in reviving rivers. And when you enter this area, you're struck because there's not even any litter by the road, which is very unusual for Rajasthan. But that's because there are no shops, there's nowhere to buy food. It is simply a self-sustaining climate and self-sustaining lifestyle. And the community then got together in order to try to restore the water situation. And the Flow Partnership was involved in this particular intervention, but there were other interventions alongside. And you can just see here a small group of people who are meeting to bless the land. And then what happens is the villagers, and you can see this bank appearing here, the villagers get together and with their tractors and with outside support as well, like paying for the digger, they create they move the soil and create this barrier in the heat of June, but in time for the monsoon of 2009. And even though the bank does not come here in the normal sense, because there's no business, the community are in a way making their own bank. And so here you can see this effort of moving mud and calculating this place where the water can be collected. And then when the monsoon comes, this is 30th of August 2019, the first picture was in May. Incredibly, the area behind the bank that's been created fills up with water. So this is about 10,000 cubic meters of water that's filled up. And this immediately enables new hectares of farmland to be created. It enables the community to prosper and for wheat and to be sown in this new area. So it produces an incredible transformation of the area. And when we went there and looked over this, our hearts really jumped and we were silent, because this is a transformation of an area where birds come, people can make a living. Farmland can be sown and looked after. And this is not something that is an order that's imposed. When water comes, it transforms an area because water is life. It has its own law. It has its own quality. So here are the wheat fields, the new wheat fields that extended from the pond. So a huge number of wheat fields, and this is the new view of the farmer over over the land, because water has transformed what was arid and what could not sustain life into something that is now vital and can sustain life. So I just want to return and to finish off now by looking at the situation of Pune. So here is a map of Pune, and here you can see the beautiful situation Pune is in with regards water. So you have the headlands with these river sources. You have these rivers all flowing into Pune. But the red areas are the increasing urbanization. And of course, urbanization means there's a lot of concrete, and so there's less chance for the water to percolate down. This blue area here is an area of, is the dam, the big dam that's called Kadakwalsa Dam on the river Muta. And that holds about 2 million cubic meters of water. So if you look at this map, you can see the idea of water as under the water law, not under the water law, under the law of regulation. So water is treated like a resource. Here you have the people who buy it. Here you have the water collected, and you have everything controlled. So you try to create a resource out of water that becomes a commodity for people to use. But what's happened in Pune? In 2018, there was huge droughts. And that's continuing with a lot of villages reporting less groundwater level. And in August 2019, there was this huge flood when the dam became too full during the monsoon because of a record rainfall, and they had to release a huge amount of water into the river, which then flooded and caused devastation to crops, to people. And again, you can see that this water is angry. It's not calm. This freedom of water can't be controlled. It can't be stopped because it's not being met. It's not being understood. It's the control that it's trying to be put under is not adequate to contain it. And this is a kind of metaphor for where we are at the moment. And so what I'd like to say, to end up with, is that I would like to invite that New Law College is not a new law college, but becomes a college of new law. And that this new law is going to find a balance between the old system of imposing an order, trying to surrender individual freedoms for a common good, trying to harness nature's energies to make a productive and a rich culture. That this way of working needs to be balanced with an understanding of what is the nature's law, what is water law. How can we work with nature at a really nation and international scale in order to understand that something greater than ourselves is involved here, and that something greater than simply a court of justice that can say what is right, say what is wrong, and form a verdict or a judgment between those two polarities is at stake here. And if we do not respond to this challenge, even though that challenge might seem a huge thing for us to do, given that we focus so fixedly on this one way of seeing, then we are going to stand in the dock of nature's law. And that is what we are increasingly seeing with the floods, the droughts, the climate, the pandemic. We have to learn something new. We have to transform in order to understand the world that's beyond our control. And I very much invite you to stand for us to stand together, both in this conference today and tomorrow, but also as a group of people, as with the Flow Partnership, who's trying to bring together partners to hold this alliance of people working traditionally and caringly with the environment. And that we stand together to usher in a new law, a new balance between what we control and contain and what we have to meet in its freedom, in its quality. So I will stop there, and many thanks for this opportunity, and I very much look forward to the actions and the new understandings that can come out of this conference and this inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on the topic. And we are obliged to hear those words of appreciation directly coming from you. Now we move to the last segment of today's conference, that is question and answer session. The questions have been put up by our attendees. We will follow the same chronology to proceed with question and answer session. The first lot of question is for Mr. Shardul Tiwari, sir. The first question for you, which has been put up by one of our attendees, is, sir, as you mentioned in your speech, India is energy-starved nation, but we all know that it has got abundance of natural resources, and to speed up its development, it needs to make efficient use of those resources. At the same time, keeping all the international environment treaties at par, how can India abide by those treaties and make effective and efficient use of those resources? How can you justify India's action?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's a very pertinent question. One of the important things I would say is India is doing a bit of its fair share of promoting renewable energies, as in we are developing a lot of solar parks, windmills in South India. Recently, our Prime Minister inaugurated one of the largest solar power in the world. But what I would like to say is India potentially, what I would suggest if India doesn't do is not follow the path which the current industrialized world did. So, for example, US today is so reliant on coal and now natural gas that it is becoming very difficult for them to transition from natural gas to renewable energies, right? Because they have so much of centralized generation. So hopefully, like what we call as learning from other people's mistakes. So if India can focus more on decentralized renewable energy sources and promoting them as much as possible, that would be really helpful for India. But as we know right now, we are still far away from that goal because 75% of electricity which is generated in India is still through coal, right? So it is very, very big chunk of carbon-based fuel. But working more towards decentralized, smaller microgrids, mini grids, and renewable energy sources would help India, right, to meet its energy demand and be green at the same time.
Thank you, sir. The next question to you is, how is active waste management important for sustainable generation of energy in any country?
very important. Like nothing could be more important in the today's scenario than waste management. In fact, European Union now is promoting what they call a circular economy, right? That's what the EU's target is, like as in to recycle as much as possible. I think their target by 2050 is to recycle almost 80% of waste which is generated, any product which is generated. So the circular economy is the buzzword today, especially in the EU context. In US, still it is far behind. But yes, recycling is very, very important. Like I think because we have finite resources, and it is very important uh, to know what kind of model we want to develop, right? So if it is a consumption based model where we just consume things and throw away, we use iPhone 10, 1 year later iPhone 11 comes in, we throw iPhone 10, we don't recycle. Very few of us recycle iPhone 10, as in the companies don't have a model that they'll take your i10 iPhone 10 back and recycle it to iPhone 11, right? You have to throw it and get a new iPhone 11. So having this concept of developing a model of circular economy, recycling is very important, extremely important in this context.
Thank you, sir. That's all for you. And now we move to our next keynote speaker, Miss Karuna ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, the first question for you is we have seen practice of dumping hazardous waste in oceans, which has impacted sea life in a very drastic manner. A recent study says that there will be more masks than jellyfish in the oceans. Given the present COVID-19 pandemic situation, use of plastic has increased with PPE kits and plastic seals, etc. What would you suggest as option to safeguard the oceans from these plastic disposables? Ma'am, in addition to this, Mr. Rajesh Pardesi, a PhD research scholar from Bharati Vidyapeeth deemed university, raises his question that if reusable plastic bags aren't sanitized properly after each use, can they harbor dangerous viruses and bacteria spread? Shall the reuse of such viruses be banned?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that we are in a pandemic era, despite of everything else. So safety first. I would say safety first, and as much as I'm trying to live a plastic-free lifestyle, I am currently putting safety first for myself as well, because it's not just for myself, but for everyone around me. I have to be conscious of that. The second thing is, I am not a health expert in terms of, okay, like what amount of bacteria would be there when you are using a reusable bag versus a new plastic bag. So that is something that I would say, you should look up with your health officials. You should look up at the official website of the Indian government dealing with coronavirus, and a lot of other websites like, CDC for the US, and you will get more information on that. Personally, what I do is I have been using my reusable bag, and I have to sanitize it every time, and I have to put it away when I come back, and I have to wash my hands. But I feel more comfortable doing that now. In the previously, I used to in the beginning of the virus, when the situation was very bad where I was, I just had to use the bags in the supermarket. But this is just like a personal choice. I would not go out and recommend what bag to use or what not, because I understand at the moment we have to put safety first. But coming to the first question, or the first part of the question, indeed, that plastics are increasing, and I think the global world is very aware of it, and they're realizing that this situation is getting very bad. So how can we stop the plastics from getting in the ocean? The first thing is we have to make sure that we are disposing them properly. But second thing that I want to say is, given that the world is being aware of this plastic situation and related to the pandemic, I've been aware of a lot of innovative solutions that have come up. So I've been reading a lot about, what are the innovative solutions that are coming up to tackle that, when it comes to PPEs or mask. Like mask is the most commonly form of PPE. So a lot of solutions that I've seen is to do with using alternate forms of plastic. So one of them is, I was even looking at it, and seaweed is naturally antibacterial, and they're now trying to look into how can we use seaweed to produce antiviral, antibacterial masks, which are good for the environment. At the same time, even if they end up in the ocean, they won't affect the environment. And then I've also seen companies taking waste plastic and developing and recycling them into PPEs. So trying to, again, link the circular economy with which my colleague Shadul talked about. So how can we take the waste that is already in the environment and obviously done in a very clean and sanitized waste, not just any waste, but waste that would otherwise end up in the environment. How can we take that and produce PPEs out of it? So I've seen a lot of these solutions are coming up. So the pandemic is still very new. In the beginning, everyone has to put their safety first. But of course, we are living in a world with a lot of innovators, and as and when we're learning more about the virus and we're learning to live with it to some extent, at least until the vaccine is out, we are going to count on all the amazing innovators. We're going to come up with solutions to avoid plastic.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question for you is from Lakshmi Priya. She's a law aspirant. She asks you, a lot of topics such as blue carbon, ocean acidification, and plastic pollution were discussed. But how are the industrial activities such as aquaculture and seabed mining that are seeing a growth now are affected and are exploited by the governments and are around the world? So what would you suggest on those issues, ma'am?
They are very big issues, especially seabed mining, which is very key for 2020, because a lot of contracts have been handed out to a lot of companies when it comes to seabed mining this year. And the civil society and the NGO community are starting to become more aware of it and have been actively lobbying against that. So because of the pandemic, some of the things were left in limbo. So the good thing is a lot of negotiations were postponed, which were important, but at the same time, a lot of things to do with seabed mining were also, I wouldn't say postponed, but kind of halted. But this year is very important for seabed mining, and I myself starting to read a lot more about it and how can we be involved. In terms of extractive industries, as I said, it's true. A lot of governments now that they're realizing the potential of the ocean, they are thinking about how can we exploit it. We're talking about seabed mining, we're talking about aquaculture. Aquaculture is really damaging to the environment if not done properly. But this is where, I think, the civil society and academics who are very keen on this issue, they come in with the research that they're doing. For example, one thing that I'm looking into is seaweed. Which is a big source of blue carbon. And I said it could be used, in a lot of products like bioplastic, biofuel. But the thing is, if we don't, if we don't harvest the seaweed sustainably, if we don't harvest it without disturbing the, main bed, then the blue carbon is lost and it goes back into the atmosphere. So then this is where, people working in this space, people who are passionate about it and working in it, what we are trying to do is, coming up with, for example, a sustainable algae council, or how can we come up with a form of metrics where, when you are farming and harvesting algae, there are certain sets, certain metrics and guidelines you follow that it's done in a sustainable way without impacting the ocean. Speaking of aquaculture, I was reading a lot about seaweed. It's also important to note that when seaweed farming is done together with aquaculture farm, they actually work very well, because the seaweed forest actually improves water quality, and all the nutrients that are lost and enter the ocean and pollute the ocean from aquaculture, with cross eutrophication, the seaweed farms actually help neutralize it. So I'm still learning a lot about seaweed and the coastal ecosystems, but this person who asked it is very right. It has to be done in a way that is not just exploiting. How can we make use of the resources that we have, but we don't do what we were doing with the land. We exploited our land, and now all of a sudden we're like, okay, we have 70% of the ocean that now is for us to exploit. How can we do that? No, I think we have to learn from what we did to the land and not do that for the ocean.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we move to our next keynote speaker, Dr. Philip Francis, sir. So,
Yeah. Hi.
yeah. Hello, sir. So, the first question for you is, while one part of the world stares at water scarcity, other faces the threat of being subsumed by rising water levels. How do you assess this situation? Is there in is there a single unified strategy through which both these issues could be balanced?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the problem that we've identified is that water is no longer being held where it falls. So often you have concrete and drains that take the water straight out and urban surfaces. And so a lot of water that used to go into the ground and be held in the aquifer is simply draining away. And when you take into account more than that, that there's landscapes are degrading, forests are being cut, then the whole water cycle that locally used to regulate the weather, it regulated the temperature, it regulated that there was room in the system for if there was a dramatic rain event for that water to be absorbed. That's now totally lacking. And you might notice in Pune, for instance, that the climate is now different. The pattern of weather is different because you've sort of unplugged that natural system of upholding the climate. And the result is that, yeah, huge areas are becoming desertified because there's no water, but also you get these huge buildups and concentrations of storm events which are causing these terrible floods. So all of these events, I would say, are being exacerbated by this lack of balance in how we treat water and how we treat the landscape. And this is in addition to the climate, the carbon issue, that we're warming the climate. So I would definitely say there is one issue behind it, and you can in fact use the same types of methods of holding the water by building these ponds or log dams or rain gardens, allowing it to soak into the ground, having trees to restore the water cycle locally, and that these can work for both floods and droughts.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. The next question for you is, with climate events like El Nino having a catastrophic impact on agricultural practices in countries like India, do you foresee a reasonable partnership between countries to effectively counter this threat?
Now, that's a very good question again, which maybe will be returned to tomorrow. That nationalism grew up with technology in order to promote your own progress as a culture and to compete with other countries. And that the threat we're facing at the moment is not respecting national borders. It's a completely universal challenge, and we do not have a body that can act at that level of scale. And so the UN is there, but that was created much more for peace and wartime. And there is a real kind of void. There's a real niche that's open for somebody to come up with a balanced law, a balanced ecological law, where looking after the environment is something that is fundamentally protected and fundamentally respected, and that happens alongside material law and property law and trying to make the most of resources. So I think it's an absolute necessity that in 2 or 3 years, such a body that has more kind of buy-in and commitment from the countries needs to come into operation in order to oversee some of the scale of work that needs to happen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I thank all our keynote speakers to patiently answer all our questions put up by our attendees. Now I would request Yash Harshvardhan to propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ayush. And thank you to all the participants who very enthusiastically put forth their questions. With this, today, we have completed the first leg of our two-day international conference on the perspectives of global governance in the pandemic era. All the brainstorming sessions have been very insightful, making it extremely beneficial for the community at large. We now proceed to the vote of thanks. It is indeed my proud privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of the Environment Cell, Bharati Vidyapeeth, deemed to be University New Law College, Pune, we would like to express our sincere thanks to Honorable Mr. Justice Adarsh Kumar Goyal, Chairperson, National Green Tribunal, Mr. Shardul Tiwari, Graduate Research Assistant, Michigan Technological University, Ms. Karuna Rana, co-founder SIAH, a youth-led organization, Dr. Philip Francis, Senior Faculty, Schumacher College, Darlington, United Kingdom. At the outset, I would like to pay rich tributes to our founder chancellor, Dr. Patangrao Kadam sir, because of whose blessings this event has been a great success. Our special thanks goes to our principal ma'am, Dr. Bhagyashree Deshpande ma'am, a woman of great principles who conceptualized the idea of a dedicated environmental cell in the college. A warm thanks goes to our chief coordinator, Dr. Jyoti Dharma ma'am, our faculty coordinator, Dr. Jayashree Khandare ma'am, whose belief in hard work and never say die attitude has developed an excellent work culture in the environment cell. Finally, let me confess that behind all our successful webinars lies the combined and dedicated efforts of all our volunteers and our technical team who make our digital presence a class apart. In the end, let me thank each and every participant for showing their interest in this event. Thank you to all.
Uh, just, just a small request to all our keynote speaker. We will be having a group photo, so I would request each one of you to please turn on your webcams.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.